Hello and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. My name is Kelly Vlahos and I'm here with my producer, Christopher Leonard in the background, and my very special guest, Jim Webb. Jim, thank you for coming on the show today. This is just the perfect time for you to be here.
Oh, thank you, Kelly. It's my pleasure to be here. It's also great to see you again. You're one of my favorite people in DC, have been for a long time, and it's just great to be able to see your face and catch up, even if we're live. So,
Absolutely. And so, for those who don't know Jim, Jim Webb served as a Marine in Marine Infantry in the Iraq War at the height of the insurgency. More recently, he worked for Senator Rand Paul, specifically on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and also has worked on campaigns and advocacy, and really is one of the best military analysts that I know. So let's get right to it. I mean, I have a bunch of questions teed up for you today, Jim,
Mhm.
but you know. Secretary of Defense, I'm not going to say Secretary of War until Congress ratifies it, but Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth held one of his press conferences to talk about Iran war operations with the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, this morning. He said in the coming days, the conflict would be decisive, and that he ran down the number of targets that the United States and Israel have affected against Iran. He also says the number of projectiles launched by Iran in the past 24 hours represented the lowest during the war. It's trying to maintain this idea that Iran is running out of ammunition and muscle and missiles.
Mhm.
Um, he says Iran knows that there's nothing that they can militarily do about it. He also talked a little bit about boots on the ground, but let's just go to a few seconds of Hegseth in cut 17, Chris.
As far as President Trump and boots on the ground, I don't understand why the base, which they have already, they understand, wouldn't have faith in his ability to execute on this. Look at his track record of pursuing peace through strength, America first outcomes. What he's simply saying, and it's exactly true, and I've said from this podium too, we're not going to foreclose any option. You can't fight and win a war if you tell your adversary what you are willing to do or what you are not willing to do, to include boots on the ground. Our adversary right now thinks there are 15 different ways we could come at them with boots on the ground. And guess what? There are. So if we needed to, we could execute those options on behalf of the President of the United States and this department.
Wow. So that's where Hegseth stands this morning.
Mhm.
I want to talk to you a little bit about boots on the ground and how well prepared we are for executing the type of mission that Hegseth is talking about here. But I have to say that there are a number of military analysts, any retired generals and admirals, who are usually out there on media pumping up war, or at least trying to justify or explain away failure. But it's not happening. We have a cut here, a cut one, Chris, from Barry McCaffrey.
Hegseth in some ways looks like a comic book tough guy. And so I think increasingly inside the Pentagon, there's an element of chaos and hysteria to decision making. Our remaining objectives in the Gulf War are stop the nuclear program and open the Gulf of Hormuz. Each of them are in danger. You cannot stop a nuclear weapons program unless you have inspectors on the ground with robust rules of investigation. That's not going to happen under the current approach by the United States or Israel. The second thing you got to do, you got to open the Gulf of Hormuz. I think the Iranians can outlast us, and no U.S. Navy warfighting vessel wants to be in the Persian Gulf, shallow water, restricted maneuver space, and subject to instant attack by mini subs, floating naval mines, cruise ballistic missiles. It's just a nightmare of an operation. So the whole notion of forcing passage, even if the NATO allies joined us, is really tenuous. This is probably not going to work. We have to have a diplomatic solution.
Okay, Jim, I have to talk to you a little bit about your excellent long form interview with Tucker Carlson last week, where
Thank you.
among a range of military topics, you talked, about this prospect, boots on the ground, and really clanged the alarms about the fact that you don't think that the military is up to task for a ground invasion, whether it's against one of the islands or even the mainland to get uranium, which is another cockamamie scheme that's making the rounds
Very
today.
much.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about what you mean by unprepared?
Sure. So the first thing, I can't say what McCaffrey said any better. I think he's right on the money. And the first thing you got to look at when we start talking about boots on the ground is what strategic objective is this fulfilling, really? It appears to me to be a reaction to a problem that we caused by going off half cocked when we attacked the Iranians on February 28th. Now, when it comes to executing a ground operation in Iran or on these islands, the the best way to take a look at this is look at the track record of how America has done these kinds of operations before, where you have a massive buildup. I think the invasion of Iraq is a good one. Not that I agree with that at all or agree with what we're doing in Iran, but you put the assets in place for all kinds of particular contingencies in advance of what you're going to do. And the most probable course of action that the Iranians were going to take if faced with an existential threat, and I heard this from in Track 2 negotiations 6, 7 years ago when I participated in them in the Senate on behalf of Rand Paul, with Senator Paul in the room as well. But they illustrated to us that this is the thing that they are going to do, and they have been preparing for it for at least 20, possibly 30, even maybe even 40 years or longer, because it is the number one lever by which they can counterbalance the United States. They understand by observing and participating in the Iraq War to the extent that they did, that facing the United States in a conventional head-on sense is really a bad idea. We have great equipment, we have the most well-trained guys on earth. When they're there in enough mass to make a difference on the battlefield, which they are not right now, but we can be fought asymmetrically. And the ultimate asymmetrical move that Iran has made is to close the Straits of Hormuz and to force the rest of the global community to not necessarily get behind them, but to put pressure on us to open the straits by relieving or releasing our military campaign by bringing it back and in effect exactly what Mr. McCaffrey said, which is to outlast America in that particular sense. Now, when you take a look at the troop composition that we have in the region, recent reports say that we have 50,000 people, on the ground, 50,000 soldiers on the ground in the greater Persian Gulf, which is only about 10,000 more than what we normally have in the region. So that is elements of the 82nd Airborne, that is a couple of Marine battalions coming off a ship, and that is not enough to seize and hold terrain, particularly in a strategically important place where you're going to face a ton of resistance, like the Straits of Hormuz. Now, do I doubt that the U.S. Marines or 82nd Airborne could get on an island and accomplish some intermediate objectives at the tactical and strategic level? No, no. Our guys are really well trained. They fight hard. They know what they're doing. But on the backside of that is, what do you do once you get there? And that's the big problem, where if you're there, you have to hold the terrain. And at some point, you have to resupply all the troops on the deck. You have to do CASEVAC. And you have to figure out how to do sustained operations that will counterbalance the most probable course of action by the Iranians, which is to turn the troops on the ground, whether it's Keshem, whether it's the Iranian shoreline, whether it would be super foolish to go into Karg. It's a completely different story. It's once you're there, you have to hold it, and you're a giant target for everything in the Iranian inventory, and you know primarily ballistic missiles and drones, which is something that, quite frankly, we have not shown the ability to counteract over the course of this entire conflict. And doing so is an unnecessary risk of American lives for objectives that aren't laid out clearly at all.
Yeah, and could we go back to the 50,000
Mhm.
troops that we supposedly have in the region? Now, I'm reading, last week that we have shuttled troops off bases into hotels, working remotely. Some of them are in Europe. So, what's going on here? There's a little bit of a shell game. So, do we have 50,000 in theater, or are those just the 40,000 that are typically there, plus the ones that we are sending? Because it sounds to me that there are a number of personnel who
Mhm.
aren't being used for this fight, and if anything, we're shuttling them away out of their own safety. And can you talk a little bit about that? Why we have so many troops in the region for peacetime, and then when we're in a hot war, we have to send them fleeing for hotels and safer spaces.
Mhm. Yeah, it's so the 50,000 there, the 40,000 there are a misnomer. Those aren't all combat troops. A very small percentage of our troops at any given time are combat troops. So we're talking about maybe a third of the guys on the ground are, what you would call war fighters. The rest are logistical support. They're doing computer operations, really any job in the military that you can really think of. So when it comes down to it, like you take a look at the big flex we had with 2,000 Marines off the coast with a Marine Expeditionary Unit. I was a Marine Infantryman. I've done a MEU workup, and you're talking out of that 2,000 right now, between 8 and 900 are actual infantry, and everybody else is there to support them. So it's a really a much smaller number, and it's a drop in the bucket, particularly when you're going into somebody else's country, where they can mass however many people they want at the point of inflection, and we would need a lot more if we were going to do this correctly, at least.
So the two Marine Expeditionary Units, MEUs, that are being sent. Talk a little bit about that. Now, you and I had an offline conversation
Mhm.
about how you believed, rightly so, that at some point several years ago there was a massive reorganization of the Marine Corps and these MEUs away from the type of skill set that they would need to fight this war, and more designed to execute confrontation with China. Can you talk about how we
Right.
might have stepped on a rake there?
Oh, absolutely. It's when people think about the Marine Corps, they think about Iwo Jima, World War II, the great amphibious operations in Korea, even what we were capable of, up until probably about 10 or 15 years ago. This is traditional, kick in the front door, land in force, where the Marine Corps at that time, up until Force Design 2030, was effectively a war in the box. Where you have a completely scalable from a battalion up to a division level that can be landed with all of the accoutrement that goes with a warfighting organization, from tanks, aircraft, attack helicopters, artillery, and and they all train together, they all work together, and the doctrine supports the infantry at the front. It was very unique. More recently, we have switched over to what is called FD 2030, or as I mentioned, Force Design 2030, where there was a conscious decision by the Marine Corps itself to pivot away from this mission and effectively divest it. They got rid of all of their tanks. They got rid of a lot of their attack helicopter assets. They got rid of tube artillery in favor of rocket systems like HIMARS, with the intent to go into what they call denied or contested areas, all of these little islands all over the Pacific, where we would put little teams of Marines who had what's called low signature, meaning they blend in, they don't have a lot of electronic emission, they're hard to find, and they would control the waterways and interdict and disrupt potential Chinese invasions of the different island chains out there. It's been it's caused a lot of heartburn for people like myself and people of the old Corps, number of generals and combat legends, shall I say, from the Vietnam era. We think divesting the capabilities that they did was a particularly bad idea. Now, put all that together, where you now have a landing force which is effectively light infantry. It's smaller. They've gotten rid of a couple hundred Marines per battalion. There are no longer tanks. There's no longer the type of assets that they could bring to bear. It's a very scaled down artillery contingent that goes in. And we're asking them to kind of go, hey, diddle diddle, right up the middle and seize a beachhead or an island, which is very much of the old school Marine Corps, just without the equipment. And this does not make a whole lot of sense because one of the principles of FT 2030 is that when you land these folks or land these Marines on different islands, you do it in a sense where they are not necessarily invisible, but they're hard to find. And what we'd be doing is putting them right out in the open and running them right up against potentially Iranian defenses. And what happens next is also, it's part of the problem, right? Where if they get ashore, if they're led ashore, which is would be a high possibility, they don't have the necessary manpower and equipment to dictate the tempo against a dug-in enemy or a large-scale insurgent force that's opposing them. They'll be fixed in place and once again become big targets or have a giant target on their back for every asset in the Iranian military or the IRGC can bring to bear.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know if I have this full screen set, Chris, but you had been quoted in a responsible statecraft piece, along with other veterans who had served in wars, and you said something to the effect of, this would look more like Gallipoli than Vietnam. Can you explain that analogy?
Sure. You love in America, or we love to in America, compare every one of these pieces of adventurism to the Vietnam War, where there was a slow buildup in country, and we just get sucked further and further and further and further in. One of my favorite battles to study in the history of warfare is Gallipoli, where the British, upon the idea of one Winston Churchill, that's actually got him fired from his job, decided to seize parts of the Dardanelles in order to force Turkey's hand in World War One, and they took a large force that had preparation issues, was not really prepped for the terrain, was not prepped for the mission, and dumped them in thinking that this is the British Empire and that the Ottoman Empire was the sick old man of Europe. And they would just fold and kind of get out of the way. And they landed them on beaches at the base of a lot of very hilly, mountainous terrain, forcing these guys to fight their way up. And the Turkish forces were very, very well prepared. Now, did the British, led by the Aussies, end up grabbing a beachhead and conducting combat operations for a long period of time? They did, but it was effectively a fight for survival with incredibly high casualties on both sides. And the end result of that, the carnage, was an independent Australian state not too far down the road. And it didn't work. And we're kind of facing the same type of scenario and the same type of terrain and the same type of hubris coming out of the Pentagon. And it really makes me nervous that we could potentially have something similar if we were decide to try that.
Now, not everybody agrees with you. Are you
Oh
surprised?
no, not at all.
There are people like Frank McKenzie, former general, who in this clip we're about to show, he's representing the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, or JINSA, which is very highly integrated U.S.-Israeli organization, has plenty of retired 4-stars on its masthead. He said that the U.S. military gamed this out, and they are right on track. QSOT 2.
All right.
This is part of a plan that's been in existence for many years. What we're doing right now is we're reducing Iranian ability to target ships in the Strait through their short-range missiles, their drones, and other activities. We do that by maintaining air superiority over southern Iran on a 24/7 basis, looking for where these missiles are and striking them relentlessly. Once we reduce those to a very low level, then you'll be able to go in, if necessary, sweep for mines. I'm not certain they put mines in the water yet. I predict eventually they will. It's their nature. But we have the ability to do this. We're on plan. I'll be honest with you, Margaret. I've simulated this many years in many positions at Central Command. We're a little further along than we would have expected to be at this point in all the simulations that I've seen.
I'm going to guess in your simulations you looked at what would happen to the Strait of Hormuz, even though the president said no one ever thought of it. You thought of it, didn't you?
The U.S. military thinks of a lot of things. We certainly have thought of the Strait of Hormuz,
Yep.
thought of Karg Island, think of all those islands on the southern littoral of Iran.
Okay, now within this wonderful interview that you did with Tucker Carlson, you talked a little bit about Millennium Challenge. I think that's what the name of it. And Tucker was absolutely gobsmacked to hear that they did war game this challenge between the U.S. and Iran, I believe, over Hormuz. But Can you talk a little bit about the results of that wargaming and why Tucker might have been so surprised at what the military did next?
Oh, sure. And I have a bit of a caveat at the end of that, but so 2002, General Van Riper, who is one of the guys who has opposed Force Design 2030 from its inception point, was selected to head the Red Team, which was a simulated Iranian force. Granted, this is 24 years ago, but it was supposed to be a 14-day war game in which we were reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Van Riper used asymmetrical assets, including suicide boats. We hadn't really come up with the drone concept yet, and uh, it was not a reality that the Iranians had a significant ballistic missile program or threat, and he still managed to shut the war game down in one day. It was over in one day, where he caused 20,000 simulated American casualties. And the outrage from within DoD was so great on that they completely revamped how the Red Team was supposed to fight, and causing Van Riper to quit. Being the head of the Red Team, his point was very simple. It's, if we're not going to do this for real and we're just trying to get a simulated result, why am I doing this? Why are we doing this? And DoD's answer at the time was, well, we paid for 14 days. We have 13 days left. So, let's keep playing in the sandbox to try and find out, you know, what are the lessons we can learn, from this exercise. But you get a result that is not true. Um, you know, we flash forward 24 years and we take a look at the actual Iranian capabilities and their will to fight, which was cemented by killing the Ayatollah on day one, and we do not have a proven counterbalance to the issues of drones and ballistic missiles. And I'll illustrate the at least 10 radar stations that have been hit across the Middle East. Multi billion-dollar losses. It's taken away a lot of our eyes and ears. These were highly targeted. And some people have been out there saying, well, this kind of stuff just happens in war. We take casualties, we lose equipment. I don't remember this from when I'm in, and I can tell you without any kind of question that these installations that were hit were probably some of the most, if not definitely the most heavily defended pieces of terrain within the region, with anti-aircraft defenses and THAADs and the whole gamut. Yet they managed to get through one by one and take them out. Now, one of the things that we really lack at the tactical and operational level is layered air defense. And if we can't protect our most important pieces of equipment and hardware in the region, which, it's not just about Iran with some of these domes. It has to do with how our entire ballistic missile defense around the world uh, is configured. It's their relay points. Then we're going to have a really hard time protecting our guys when they're exposed in the middle of a very fluid combat situation on the ground. So, uh, you know, I take what General McKenzie is saying there, but I'm sure they're paying him well to say that. I am out here not getting paid, which is fine by me. I've given the opportunity to speak my mind. So I would challenge him to take a hard look at what is actually on the table.
What I get from that clip is General McKenzie just looks very robotic. Like he's
Mm.
just repeating nostrums and talking points and talking points and nostrums that were put in front of him by his Israeli partners. I mean, he is
Right.
a representative of JINSA in that very interview. Let's talk about Israel's role a little bit. One of the things that Tucker had asked you was, how would you get out of this war? And you said something to the effect of, tell Israel that it's time to step aside. Now, I watched and I read the resignation letter of Joe Kent, who
Mhm.
resigned in protest 2 weeks ago from his role as counterterrorism director in the Trump administration. He took a lot of slings and arrows for casting some of the blame for this war on our Israeli partners. And the knives came out. Oh, he's anti-Semitic. He's confabulating the whole Israeli influence in this war. Can you talk a little bit about that? How there was this rush to the gates to cry anti-Semitism and not really examine like what he was saying, and talk a little bit about why you think that Israel should step aside in as a sort of the only way for us to extricate ourselves from what is increasingly looking like a failed operation here.
Right. So point one would be look, we need to, from the inception point, look at how our forces were configured across the region. We did not have adequate air defenses in place. We did not have contingency forces on the ground. It was very clear that we were not prepared to do this. Point number two is that we did this on behalf of the Israeli government. This was their objective. And you need to look no further than the statements of the Speaker of the House and Marco Rubio coming right out of the gate, day one or day two of this operation. They said we did it on behalf of the Israelis because the Israelis were going to do it. And once the Israelis did it, our forces in the region were going to be impacted or under fire as a result of that. That is literally their justification for us being in this conflict. We were in the middle of negotiations with the Iranian government. There are a lot of indicators that there was a deal on the table to button up this whole mess and enable much of the world to move forward out of this. The anti-Semitism against or the anti-Semitic attacks on a guy like Joe Kent are ridiculous. He is incredibly well respected within the veterans community, and what he did was an incredibly brave act. And he said the loud part out loud. It had already been admitted that this was the reason we had gone to war in the first place. Now, when we talk about a resolution, we have to do exactly that, Kelly. We have to put our put the Israelis back in their place with our relationship with them. They are our client. They exist in effect because of the support we provide them. And never before have they been driving the bus on our policy in that region like this. They took us to war, and quite simply, we could just cut military funding if they don't agree to do what we say. And the more complicating factor in this is that you can watch over a complete arc in this conflict. Every single time President Trump or other people indicate that we might have negotiations ongoing for some kind of off ramp, uh, there is an escalatory attack, whether it's on civilian power grid type of places or desalination plants, gas fields, the assassination of the Ayatollah, the assassination of the gentleman who Vice President Vance is supposed to negotiate with. And you can't look at that in any other way logically and not think it's designed to prevent us from being brought to the negotiating table, which is what we need. And there's one final piece here. If I think I could throw it out there in terms of a potential solution. One that would enable President Trump to save a little bit of face is that we have all these bases in the region. They're pretty much wrecked by any account. You can look at the New York Times. Even they're reporting this, that they're uninhabitable at this point. He promised voters starting in 2016, no more stupid wars, and he would get us out of the Middle East. He's on the record for more than a decade talking about how dumb these wars are in the region. So the bases are wrecked. He has a mandate from the American people to do this, not war, but to get us out. And the number one thing the Iranians want as a result of this is to have no more threat from America in the region. We would allow the Iranians to go to their people and say, "Hey, we drove America out of here," and it would go over well. It might staunch some of their desire for revenge after the way we've conducted this. And he could come back. President Trump could come back to the American people and say, "Hey, Iran's no longer a threat. We no longer need these bases. That's the evidence of it. I'm bringing them home. I made you a promise," and potentially save some of his base going into the midterms.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. And I think in the perfect vision of this, that's exactly what he would do. I worry about two things. One, the Israelis aren't going to stop. And two, maybe the Iranians are going to ask for too much or more than Trump is willing to do in terms of concessions, because they, as you know, they're in an existential fight.
Right.
They want sanctions lifted. They want to get their economy back on track. They want the bases gone, as you mentioned. They want reparations. Um, I think this is where the rubber is really going to hit the road. And
Mhm.
Trump has indicated over the last 24 hours that he might be willing to get out of this war, call it a day, even if the Strait of Hormuz is not opened, let the NATO partners and the Gulf states handle it themselves. How, just a quick question on that. How do you think that's going to land with the American people if he just says it's over when we know essentially it's not over?
So if he just says it's over when we know it's not over without some sort of tangible result that the American people have wanted, which is exiting the region, I think it's not going to go over well. He's dug himself a pretty deep hole on this. On the other side, do get a vote, and the longer this goes on, the more they're going to want.
Yeah.
And we have to start somewhere, though, Kelly. And I think this is a pretty good starting point. I would also think that it is well beyond time that we have leaders in this country who will stand up and say this publicly that, hey, this needs to stop. I have wondered the entire time where Congress is on this. They have ceded their authority to the executive branch in a way that I never thought was really imaginable. This is a unilateral war by the executive branch, and no one's even questioning the justification. And it is also intensely unpopular with the American people. I think I saw a poll today where President Trump's approval rating is at 33%. So getting us out would be popular. How he does it is important. Politically, he can possibly salvage some of his reputation by fulfilling a promise that he made many years ago. But it would take Congress, I think, to really get behind this and get the ball rolling. And they should be out there banging the drum, but they're not. So I'm kind of wondering what the deal is with that, quite honestly.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people are saying that Democrats fled on their spring recess without voting because honestly, they want Trump to hang himself by his own petard. I know this is a super Washington cynical take,
Mhm.
but they're happy. They know this war is a failure, and the longer it goes on, the better their prospects for the midterm, which is quite depressing in terms of where their heads may be at. Before we close out,
Mhm.
I want to introduce just one more subject where in Holy Week for Catholics, approaching Easter Sunday, we have a defense secretary who seems to be waging a holy war from the podium. Let's take a look at cut 4.
Almighty God, who trains our hands for war and our fingers for battle, you who stirred the nations from the north against Babylon of old, making her land a desolation where none dwell. Behold now the wicked who rise against your justice and the peace of the righteous. Snap the rod of the oppressor, frustrate the wicked plans, and break the teeth of the ungodly. By the blast of your anger, let the evil perish. Let their bulls go down to slaughter, for their day has come, the time of their punishment. Pour out your wrath upon those who plot vain things and blow them away like chaff before the wind.
You know, we have a pope who, during Palm Sunday Mass, had talked about war and ending war. We have plenty of Catholics out there who have been speaking from the pulpit about the death and destruction and displacement by these conflicts. And, even at my church, there's no blame assigned, but
Mhm.
it's just a call for peace. Then you listen to this guy, and it's like we're going back to the Iraq War days where you had, certain evangelical generals out there talking about holy war, talking about converting uh, Iraqis to Christianity. What's going on, Jim?
I wish I knew, Kelly. This is not in any of my teachings. I'm a proud Catholic, um, and they have a long-standing tradition of just wars, just war theory, wars of defense, wars of necessity, And there's absolutely no way that you can take any war of choice and qualify it as necessary at any real level. But then to invoke God on your side for attacking another country, and in particular, when it was a cheap shot. Let's be real. It was a cheap shot. We were in the middle of negotiations and assassinated their leader, who, whether you like it or not, whether you like him or not, was a man of God and the head of basically an entire religion within a society. And there's all kinds of other ramifications, but to get up on the pulpit and to say it is just in the eyes of God is it's pretty much blasphemy in my opinion. And I'm not a religious scholar, and I try to do my best, studying the faith, and staying within the confines of my own faith. And I'm not here to cast judgment. But when I hear that, it is absolutely gut wrenching and stomach turning. Now, it's one thing to pray for the troops,
Right.
to ask for their protection, but to quote the Old Testament and call for the eradication of your enemies, that's very odd, and very dangerous.
Yeah, very dangerous, and it's causing a split among the Catholics and the evangelicals on the right.
Mhm,
That's something that I'll bring you on for another show to talk about because I find it very fascinating. This has been
mhm,
going on for about a year now, but it's really erupting this week with all of these prayer breakfasts and the invocation of prayer. Even during the press conference this morning, he made it a
mhm.
prayer, and finished his remarks with an amen. And I thought that was very strange, and disturbing. But anyway, we've run out of time. Thank you so much, Jim, for
Yeah, no
joining
problem.
me.
Mhm.
This was so enlightening and illuminating, and I appreciate it. And I hope you'll come back.
Yes, please. Thanks for having me, Kelly. It's great to see you. I had fun. I hope your audience enjoyed it. And yeah, let's talk again soon.
Absolutely.
All right.